Chapter 49 of Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Chapter 49 chronicles the further proceedings of the Nickleby family, and the sequel of the adventure of the gentleman in the small clothes. While Nicholas, absorbed in the one engrossing subject of interest which had recently opened upon him, occupied his leisure hours with thoughts of Madeline Bray, and in execution of the commissions which the anxiety of brother Charles in her behalf imposed upon him, saw her again and again, and each time with greater danger to his peace of mind, and a more weakening effect upon the lofty resolutions he had formed, Mrs. Nickleby and Kate continued to live in peace and quiet, agitated by no other cares than those which were connected with certain harassing proceedings taken by Mr. Snawley for the recovery of his son, and their anxiety for Smike himself, whose health, long upon the wane, began to be so much affected by apprehension and uncertainty as sometimes to occasion both them and Nicholas considerable uneasiness, and even alarm. It was no complaint or murmur on the part of the poor fellow himself that thus disturbed them. Ever eager to be employed in such slight services as he could render, and always anxious to repay his benefactors with cheerful and happy looks, less friendly eyes might have seen in him no cause for any misgiving. But there were times, and often too, when the sunken eye was too bright, the hollow cheek too flushed, the breath too thick and heavy in its course, the frame too feeble and exhausted to escape their regard and notice. There is a dread disease which so prepares its victim, as it were for death, which so refines it of its grosser aspect, and throws around familiar looks unearthly indications of the coming change, a dread disease, in which the struggle between soul and body is so gradual, quiet, and solemn, and the result so sure, that day by day and grain by grain the mortal part wastes and withers away, so that the spirit grows light and sanguine with its lightening load, and feeling immortality at hand, deems it but a new term of mortal life, a disease in which death and life are so strangely blended, that death takes the glow and hue of life, and life the gaunt and grisly form of death, a disease which medicine never cured, wealth never warded off, or poverty could boast exemption from, which sometimes moves in giant strides, and sometimes at a tardy sluggish pace, but slow or quick is ever sure and certain. It was with some faint reference in his own mind to this disorder, though he would by no means admit it, even to himself, that Nicholas had already carried his faithful companion to a physician of great repute. There was no cause for immediate alarm, he said. There were no present symptoms which could be deemed conclusive. The constitution had been greatly tried and injured in childhood, but still it might not be, and that was all. But he seemed to grow no worse, and as it was not difficult to find a reason for these symptoms of illness in the shock and agitation he had recently undergone, Nicholas comforted himself with the hope that his poor friend would soon recover. This hope his mother and sister shared with him, and as the object of their joint solicitude seemed to have no uneasiness or despondency for himself, but each day answered with a quiet smile that he felt better than he had upon the day before, their fears abated, and the general happiness was by degrees restored. Many and many a time in after years did Nicholas look back to this period of his life, and tread again the humble, quiet, homely scenes that rose up as of old before him. Many and many a time, in the twilight of a summer evening, or beside the flickering winter's fire, but not so often or so sadly then, would his thoughts wander back to these old days, and dwell with a pleasant sorrow upon every slight remembrance which they brought crowding home. The little room in which they had so often sat long after it was dark, figuring such happy futures, Kate's cheerful voice and merry laugh, how if she were from home they used to sit and watch for her return, scarcely breaking silence, but to say how dull it seemed without her, the glee with which poor Smike would start from the darkened corner where he used to sit, and hurry to admit her, and the tears they often saw upon his face, half wondering to see them too, and he looked so pleased and happy. Every little incident, and even slight words and looks of those old days, little heeded then, but well remembered when busy cares and trials were quite forgotten, came fresh and thick before him many and many a time, and rustling above the dusty growth of years, came back green boughs of yesterday. But there were other persons associated with these recollections, and many changes came about before they had being. A necessary reflection for the purposes of these adventures, which at once subside in their accustomed train, and shunning all flighty anticipations or wayward wanderings, pursue their steady and decorous course. If the brother Cheerybles, as they found Nicholas worthy of trust and confidence, bestowed upon him every day some new and substantial mark of kindness, they were not less mindful of those who depended on him. Various little presents to Mrs. Nickleby, always of the very things they most required, tended in no slight degree to the improvement and embellishment of the cottage. Kate's little store of trinkets became quite dazzling, and for company! If brother Charles and brother Ned failed to look in for at least a few minutes every Sunday, or one evening in the week, there was Mr. Tim Linkinwater, who had never made half a dozen other acquaintances in all his life, and who took such delight in his new friends as no words can express, constantly coming and going in his evening walks, and stopping to rest, while Mr. Frank Cheeryble happened, by some strange conjunction of circumstances, to be passing the door on some business or other at least 3 nights in the week. 'He is the most attentive young man I ever saw, Kate,' said Mrs. Nickleby to her daughter one evening, when this last named gentleman had been the subject of the worthy lady's eulogium for some time, and Kate had sat perfectly silent. 'Attentive, mama?' rejoined Kate. 'Bless my heart, Kate!' cried Mrs. Nickleby, with her wonted suddenness. 'What a colour you have got! Why, you're quite flushed!' 'Oh, mama, what strange things you fancy!' 'It wasn't fancy, Kate, my dear, I'm certain of that,' returned her mother. 'However, it's gone now at any rate, so it don't much matter whether it was or not. What was it we were talking about? Oh, Mr. Frank! I never saw such attention in my life, never.' 'Surely you're not serious?' returned Kate, colouring again, and this time beyond all dispute. 'Not serious!' returned Mrs. Nickleby. 'Why shouldn't I be serious? I'm sure I never was more serious. I will say that his politeness and attention to me is one of the most becoming, gratifying, pleasant things I have seen for a very long time. You don't often meet with such behaviour in young men, and it strikes one more when one does meet with it.' 'Oh! Attention to you, mama!' rejoined Kate quickly. 'Oh, yes!' 'Dear me, Kate!' retorted Mrs. Nickleby. 'What an extraordinary girl you are! Was it likely I should be talking of his attention to anybody else? I declare, I'm quite sorry to think he should be in love with a German lady, that I am.' 'He said very positively that it was no such thing, mama,' returned Kate. 'Don't you remember his saying so that very first night he came here? Besides,' she added, in a more gentle tone, 'why should we be sorry if it is the case? What is it to us, mama?' 'Nothing to us, Kate, perhaps,' said Mrs. Nickleby, emphatically, 'but something to me, I confess. I like English people to be thorough English people, and not half English and half I don't know what. I shall tell him point blank next time he comes, that I wish he would marry one of his own countrywomen, and see what he says to that.' 'Pray don't think of such a thing, mama,' returned Kate, hastily. 'Not for the world. Consider how very—' 'Well, my dear, how very what?' said Mrs. Nickleby, opening her eyes in great astonishment. Before Kate had returned any reply, a queer little double knock announced that Miss La Creevy had called to see them, and when Miss La Creevy presented herself, Mrs. Nickleby, though strongly disposed to be argumentative on the previous question, forgot all about it in a gush of supposes about the coach she had come by. Supposing that the man who drove must have been either the man in the shirt sleeves or the man with the black eye, that whoever he was, he hadn't found that parasol she left inside last week, that no doubt they had stopped a long while at the halfway house coming down, or that perhaps being full they had come straight on, and lastly, that they surely must have passed Nicholas on the road. 'I saw nothing of him,' answered Miss La Creevy, 'but I saw that dear old soul, Mr. Linkinwater.' 'Taking his evening walk, and coming on to rest here, before he turns back to the city, I'll be bound,' said Mrs. Nickleby. 'I should think he was,' returned Miss La Creevy, 'especially as young Mr. Cheeryble was with him.' 'Surely that is no reason why Mr. Linkinwater should be coming here,' said Kate. 'Why, I think it is, my dear,' said Miss La Creevy. 'For a young man, Mr. Frank is not a very great walker, and I observe that he generally falls tired and requires a good long rest when he has come as far as this. But where is my friend?' said the little woman, looking about, after having